Hello and welcome. We have two units in the identity hierarchy teaching. And in those units, we have three lessons. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about feeling lost and disconnected and unable to move forward. If you feel lost and you don't know why clarity keeps on slipping away, if you've tried to set goals and find direction or figure yourself out, nothing seems to stick when we find ourselves in this place that I'm describing today. And this teaching is not here to tell you what to do. It's here to name what could be happening with you because scripture speaks directly to this experience, even if we haven't been taught to read scripture that way. Most people assume that their problem is identity. They think, I have to figure out who I am. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I thought God told me to do XYZ, and now I'm not sure. Or once I find the right role, if I just can be a mom, if I can get married, if I can get that job, everything will settle. And that idea does not come from scripture. It came from culture. So, what most people don't realize is that identity hasn't just been misunderstood, it's been promoted to the organizing center of life. Identity is being asked to do the job that scripture assigns to authority. And it's being used to determine meaning and safety and direction and worth. And identity was never designed to carry that weight. When scripture uses the language that we translate as identity, it is not talking about self-concept. It's not asking you to look inward and define yourself. Scripture is describing something relational and given, not something to be discovered or constructed. And we'll come back to that. But for now, it's enough to notice this. Scripture never asks identity to do the job that we've given it. And culture places an enormous weight on two questions: who am I? And what am I here to do? And those questions feel ultimate. They feel spiritual. They feel necessary. But scripture never assigns them that role. So let's name that experience honestly. Many people don't feel rebellious. They feel untethered. They aren't rejecting God. They're exhausted from trying to hold their life together internally. Decision making feels heavy. Motivation it comes in waves, and it then it disappears. And goals look clear at first, and we have them ready to go, and then they collapse, or we lose motivation, and progress feels fragile. And that's not a discipline problem, and that's not a lack of sincerity. Scripture describes this as a problem of order. The book of Judges describes the entire generation this way. Everyone did right in their own eyes. And that verse often reads as moral chaos. The scripture, though, I think invites us to something deeper. When there is no shared reference point, life becomes self-referencing. People don't become evil first, they become confused. Direction disappears, stability erodes, and everyone is left trying to interpret reality for themselves. And that produces anxiety, not freedom. Our culture taught us to organize life around identity and purpose. And identity is supposed to give meaning, and purpose is supposed to give direction. But when identity and purpose become the center, they stop being gifts and they start becoming demands. And identity turns into a self-definition. Purpose turns into a self-justification. And the self was never meant to carry that weight. Scripture shows us what happens when it tries. In Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel, the people say, let us make a name for ourselves. And that's identity language. And it's paired with purpose. Let us build. And they have vision, and they have cooperation, and they have effort. And yet scripture says that the result was confusion and scattering. God said, they're going to make this happen. We need to confuse and scatter them. Why? Because meaning and direction were being generated internally. Identity and purpose were detached from what God wanted and said. So scripture is showing us something crucial. Clarity cannot survive with self-referencing. And this helps explain why so many people can set goals but can't sustain them. Romans 1 describes humanity as exchanging the truth of God for a lie. The lie is simply not a false belief, it's just misplaced authority sometimes. So when meaning has to produce internally, the self collapses under pressure. Purpose becomes proof, goals become validation. Purpose collapses because it's being built on an identity instead of an order. So failure feels personal. That's why quitting feels like a relief. It's not because people are lazy, it's because the cost feels existential. And Ecclesiastes names this without softening: work, achieve, contribute, legacy. All of it becomes this striving after the wind when meaning has to be generated instead of received. So, purpose was never meant to justify experience, it was meant to flow from it. So, when purpose becomes foundational, people either burn out or freeze or they endlessly reinvent themselves. And that's not weakness, it's overload. So if this feels close to home, it's likely because identity and purpose became survival tools. It gave structure when life felt unstable. It gave language when pain went unnamed or undealt with. And they gave direction when no one or nothing else did. So scripture does not shame us for that. It simply refuses to build on it, because identity and purpose were never meant to be the center. They were meant to be received, not carried. So scripture has a diagnosis, and it is not, you haven't found yourself yet. It's that identity and purpose cannot function as organizing authorities. When they try, people feel lost and disoriented and stuck, not because they lack potential, but because something essential is missing. Scripture agrees that human beings need meaning and direction. The question is not whether identity and purpose matter. They do. The question is whether they can bear the weight that they've been given. And in the next teaching, we're going to look at what Scripture says identity actually is, where it comes from, and what clarity only comes when order is restored. So for now, let Scripture name what you've been feeling, because confusion is not the end, it's a signal.